it's something true to pass on down to generations yet to come. We'll never stop believing in the generosity. Our friendships keep one and become alive. For every single living creature is something that is real. Friendship happens so naturally. Oh, and how I used to wonder.
You guys hear me all right? All right, perfect. So I guess before we get started, this is a panel I've been doing for a few years now. This is a special version, so it's kind of more of an ad-lib panel since I have all the information and research in my head. I'm just basically going off of the history I have, and so there's no real script. To keep me on track, I would, if you have questions, please save them towards the end, so no interrupting in the middle of the panel. If you need to leave beforehand and want to contact me, or you want to contact me with updated information or not, I have these flyers. They're on that table there. It has a little mini timeline of the convention history I've been working on, and you can also, it has all my contact information. So if you want to send me some stuff, feel free. And with that, let's get started with this video. So welcome to the convention history panel. I am one of the community guests for this con, Chocolate Pony. You guys might know me as Animorphs. I'm in the vendor hall. So I've been working on the convention history book for almost the last decade now. I started as a student at Johns Hopkins University where I studied genetics, and I decided how about we approach the history of conventions the same way we approach evolutionary organism. And with that, I started working on this convention timeline. It's been years in the making. This is the newest version here, and I have it so a lot of these cons are all different color-coded. But specifically, I want to get to the root of what kind of makes these gatherings unique, because there is something that's very, very unique about fan conventions, whether it's a brony convention, whether it's a furry, anime, comic. It's different from like your regular trade show or a Renaissance fair. So I want to look at the history of our community, the brony community, in the wider context, and show that bronies didn't really come from an isolated bubble, and neither did our cons, yet we were a part of a larger family tree that's been going on for over 80 years, and we've actually added to that tree. Despite being a relatively small community, bronies have added a lot to the convention scene. So we're going to look specifically at where bronies come from. So this is a tiny little branch here that I've dedicated to bronies. And you'll notice there's something very unique. While most of the branches in this convention family tree I'm looking at are specifically related to mediums or genres, so comics or anime or furry, Bronies and Trekkies are the two fan-specific fandoms that have their own branch in this family tree. And I'll explain why. It's because both Trekkies and Bronies have created large conventions that have added to the overall con scene that you might not realize had an influence with how modern cons are shaped. So we'll show how Bronies kind of had their influence from both furries and the Trek scene. But to begin, we need to talk about what a BronyCon is and what a convention is. So when I use the term BronyCon, I'm not using it in the legal sense of the official BronyCon. I'm using it as a genericized term to describe all My Little Pony conventions that occurred after during the advent of G4. So if we think about it, conventions around My Little Pony have existed before G4. There's My Little Pony Toy Fair, and a lot of these conventions are actually more toy collecting conventions, which are really a different type of convention than the BronyCons that we kind of see and know today. And so here are some of the conventions that have existed over the years, and of course we are here at Ponyville Ciderfest, one of the more unique cons of this type. And to kind of understand where these cons were birthed, we have to kind of look at the birth of our specific fandom. I'm sure you all know the story of how Lauren Faust, one of the great masterminds who worked during the animation renaissance of the 90s and early 2000s, working on some fantastic movies like Iron Giant, Cats Don't Dance, and TV shows like Powerpuff Girls and Dexter and Foster's Home. She has done so much great work, and the fact that she was going to Hasbro to kind of pitch her new toy line, Galaxy Girls, and they said, hey, you know, we have this My Little Pony thing, and let's see if you could do something with this. And of course, Lauren Faust, who grew up loving the show, decided to take on the project and revamp the show how she imagined it as a kid. When she was playing with her original G1 toys, she decided to kind of craft the main six based on her headcanons of how the G1 character should be. And of course, we all know the promotion kind of came out for G4, and at first it was weirdly criticized. People who've never even seen the show called it the death of creator-driven television, which is really ironic because they didn't say that during the entire wave of Family Guy clones, so who knows. But surprisingly, a large number of millennials who grew up with some of the works Lauren Faust worked on during the animation revival are now kind of, you know, college students or just got out of college or just got out of high school, and they wanted to support Lauren Faust. Like, hey, you know, let's not, you know, write off what this will be. It could be potentially a really great show. So we got this wave of millennials and older fans. A lot of them gathered on 4chan and basically, you know, spoke out in support of Lauren Faust. Finally, when the first episode of My Little Pony came out, it was surprisingly a very good show. This is during a period where, like I said, television was dominated by Flash animation, Johnny Test, and, you know, Family Guy clones. So, of course, Lauren Faust's My Little Pony was a fascinating reboot. And it's weird because we are currently in a wave of retcons, reboots, and sequels. But what Lauren Faust did with G4 My Little Pony was so unique because it was not a cynical take on the previous material. It was not a parody or deconstruction or reconstruction, but it was a sincere, earnest attempt to kind of revamp a franchise that was essentially made to be a toy commercial. And it succeeded in a way that we might not really think of. And I don't want to say this because I'm a fan of Lauren Faust's original work with the first season of My Little Pony, but I do think My Little Pony, along with Adventure Time, ushered in a period I like to call the animation revival that saw Gravity Falls, Steven Universe, Legend of Korra. It was because of works like Lauren Faust, specifically, you know, show about strong female protagonists that made a lot of these networks, okay, maybe we could try to revamp it. And we did see a lot of like Friendship with Magic clones with other attempts of reboots, like we saw reboots of Littlest Pet Shop and stuff like that. So yeah, you guys can name it a lot. But we saw this attempt to do this with My Little Pony, and then we instantly after the new episode came out, a fan base was born. I'm sure you know the term brony also came from 4chan as well, and we need to describe this early period of the fandom. So we have to look at what this community was in the first place. So this is an early version of how I broke down the early fandom. And I think this is the more current version I broke the fandom to. Like the fandom periods could kind of fall into perfect 2-year periods. And I think my theory behind it kind of works because we have a period where in the early fandom, it was all congregated online because that's the only place you could interact with people. So it would make sense that the people who congregate online will have to go to specific websites that would gather this information, which would be the reason why news sites like Equestria Daily rose to prominence, because this is where everything is collected. And it'll also make sense that the fan collected content during this period, visual art and stories, would be the most popular type of fan content during this period, because this is a period where everything's online, you could see it, you could read it, there we go, it's all collected. Then we go to the next period where people start to shift more towards an audio medium. This is where we kind of get the start of podcasts. And once a lot of these podcasts start forming, we need a place to listen to these podcasts. So we'll have the concept of the Pony Radio Group or the Pony Network that will collect the podcasts together. But what do we do in between the podcast time? Well, it's an audio medium, so of course we'll ask for the musicians to come on board. So you'll have Pony fan music filling in the gaps between the podcasts. And so it will make sense that the content creators that were the most popular during this period were the brony musicians. Now we have to remember what this period was about, because this is a period where liking My Little Pony was seen as, oh, this is a show that was aimed for, young girls. Why are predominantly straight males liking this show? Even though we also have a high concentration of LGBT and trans fans as well, which is surprising because you don't see it as such a high concentration in a fandom like this. And it will make sense, as I explain later down the line. But to kind of justify their love of My Little Pony, a lot of these fans will like the show ironically. So when you like the show ironically, of course you're going to be engaged in meme culture. So there's a lot of brony memes that are popping out around this time saying, I just like it ironically, and here's some funny pony memes. The other way you will do it is you start contrasting what the show is about, a happy, cutesy kid show, and contrast it with something dark or grim or sad and depressing. So we start seeing this wave of fan art and fan videos where, for example, we have stories like Cupcakes or Rainbow Factory, where it's contrasting this cutesy, nice, bright world with something dark and grim. Fall Equestrian is another example of contrasting something that's supposed to be cutesy with something that's dark. If we look on YouTube, we can see the Max Gilardi videos, like the Apple.Mom series, contrasting something that's very kiddie and cutesy, but in an adult style. So this is the irony of trying to like the show, is to represent the show as the polar opposite of something it's not. And so it might not be true to the concept of the show, but it also brought on a lot of fans who like the meme culture. But as the fandom started to solidify and we started to concentrate together, a lot of the ironic fans left, and the true fans who really sincerely liked the show kind of stayed behind. So it made sense that after the first two periods, the news period and then the audio podcast period, that we'll like to start to gather and meet with each other. So we have the next period, which we'll call specifically the BronyCon period, even though I would say BronyCon and the concept of a pony convention started a few years earlier. It really, I would say this one really started when Everfree Network, which was kind of dominant force after Equestria Daily kind of started the ball rolling, used to be streaming all these panels at conventions themselves. And after BronyCon was like, no, we'll take it from here. We got it. it kind of made Equestria, Everfree Network relevant, and this is the period when I think the BronyCons kind of came on the scene. But we have to talk about the period of how these BronyCons were kind of formed. So, we all know that a lot of the Bronies started to do meetups during this period. Remember the website meetup.com? Well, a lot of meetups started appearing, and of course, there was a rush between these early meetups to try to want to form the first Brony convention. So, depending on who you ask, even though Purple Tinker was able to get the New York Brony meetup to start BronyCon first, you also had participating parties who were kind of competing with each other in tandem. You had the group in Seattle, which eventually became Everfree Northwest. You had the group in Columbus, which eventually became TrotCon. You had all these different groups trying to be the first Brony convention. But Purple Ticket was the first to beat them, and she was the one who kind of made the default template formula that all BronyCons would come to be. And like I said, this template was very unique. It took a combination of the Star Trek and the furry fandom cons and combined them together. And so to talk about these cons, we really have to go a little further back. So this is where we are with the Bronies. This is BronyCon, the first of the cons that started this little gap and eventually exploded and fizzled out. But we have to go back further. We have to go 70 years back to this tiny little period here. This is a period that's called the start of the golden age of science fiction, and this is where I'd like to trace the birth of what we now consider conventions. Now, there is a very, very tricky contention between fans of science fiction of what the first convention is. A lot of them debate it, so I have a list of a lot of these different cons here. So most science fiction fans will debate between the first Eastern Conference, also known as PhilCon, or the first British Conference, also known as the Leeds event. And it's ironic that they consider these two the first conventions. And when I bring up this one, wait, how about the first Science Fiction League meeting in New York? They say, oh no, it doesn't. We don't count that as a convention because it doesn't have the term conference in its title. So, I mean, if that's your definition of it, then it's all semantics there. So, pushing semantics aside, I decide to craft my definition of what I consider the first convention. And when I think of conventions now, the Comic Cons, the Anime Cons, the Furry Cons, the Brony Cons, what do they all have in common? Well, they're normally conventions that are held over a course of 3 days, normally on the weekend. They were normally held in a hotel venue, or at least are partnered with a hotel and a convention center. They have a dealer's area, they have an artist alley, they have panels, and they normally have some type of after-hours dance type event. Now, not all of them do, but they normally have a concert or dancing and cosplay. Well, by that definition, none of these conventions would have fallen under that category because most of these conventions had less than 100 attendees. These were essentially one-day meetups. These were essentially fans visiting other fans in someone's home or in a local library talking about science fiction for a few hours and leaving. I wouldn't consider these conventions, but the first convention I would consider is Worldcon. Worldcon was held over July 4th weekend. It was held over the course of 3 days. It was the first convention to be partnered with a hotel, and Worldcon itself would start a lot of traditions that we now kind of see today. It was from Worldcon that we had the early Proto Dealers Hall, the art show, which eventually became the Artist Alley. It's the first to have multiple programs in a book. And of course, started a lot of traditions like con badges and at other cons, con ribbons. And there's also a lot of the first cosplay appeared at Worldcon. And the second Worldcon, which was held in Chicago, had the first cosplay contest. And of course, for some of you out there, it also had the first Dead Dog Party. And the first Dead Dog Party, I could actually track to July 8th, and it was held at a staffer's house. And you might know what Dead Dogs are. The term normally sometimes refers to the last panel after closing ceremonies, where you get the feedback. Sometimes refers to the last dance of the con, but most commonly it's referred to the last party, where a lot of staffers who are done for the weekend basically just go to a hotel room and just have fun and drink, just party it up, relax a bit. And all this you could trace to Worldcon. which you can't really trace to all these previous cons. So while most old school science fiction fans disagree with my definition for what the first con is, I will say it's Worldcon, because we could trace every single con based on the Worldcon model. Maybe Leeds and PhilCon did influence Worldcon, but everything that came after Worldcon was definitely influenced by that first and second Worldcon in New York and Chicago. And of course, if you ever had to pick up your badges, you'll know that after the very first Worldcon, someone from Oklahoma decided to draw this picture in one of their fanzines showing the badge pickup line. And this was the Worldcon that was held in DC 2 years ago. So you can see the badge pickup line has been a tradition since the very first Worldcon. So
nothing changes.
Nothing has changed.
The more things change, the more they stay the same. Right?
Exactly. So this is where we get to the next type of con, the cons that we probably are more familiar with, the Comic Cons. This is where we kind of get the modern definition of conventions. So the Comic Cons introduced the concept of the Artist Alley. Specifically, it's unique because their Artist Alley evolved separately from what's happening in Japan. So the Artist Alleys in America, specifically Comic Cons, were specifically meant for people who worked within the comic book industry. So people who worked officially on Marvel and DC Comics. And it was a way for them to kind of just gather and, you know, sell their comics, sell their original pages, do on-site commissions. But in Japan, you have the concept of Comic-Ket, which came from a science fiction con that was happening in Japan around the same time. Comic-Ket, is also known as Comic Market, is essentially one giant artist alley that sells doujinshi. If you don't know what doujinshi is, it's essentially short little fan comics that normally deal with popular anime or manga character. 99% of the time, it's not safe for work, you know, smut. But, so imagine a con that's 3 times larger than San Diego Comic-Con, held twice a year. There's like no panels, no concert. There was only one giant artist alley of people selling, you know, little fan-made adult comics. And that's essentially what Artist Alley is at Comic-Con. And that started a completely different type of artist alley that the anime cons will adapt. So we have one type of artist alley in America that's all about professional artists working within the professional industry. And we have another type of artist alley starting in Japan that's all about fan art and fan culture. And for the first few decades, they're going to be very, very separate, but they're going to collide pretty soon. But we're going to have to get head out a little forward because we want to talk about the first franchise-specific con that had a dominant hold on the scene, and that is the Star Trek convention. So this is the little tricky period because if we think about what science fiction is the catch-all general term for pop culture during this early period. So if you were a fan of superheroes, a fan of anthropomorphic animals, of cartoons, of fantasy, sword and sorcery fantasy, space opera, all that would be under the umbrella of science fiction. Now, nowadays, we retroactively call it speculative fiction, but they used the term science fiction back then. This includes fantasy, this includes horror, all these genres were under science fiction. Now, these were the general cons of the day. When you think of San Diego Comic-Con today, you have anime, you have comics, you have video games, you have all these different fan groups. This is what the early science fiction cons of this period were. These were the catch-all pop culture conventions. Now, during this period, a brand new show appeared, Star Trek, and it had a very, very popular fan base. Now, what's interesting with these cons during this period is there was basically only one panel room and one panel happening at the same time. So it was expected that all the attendees for the con will go to the panel room, listen to the panel or the discussion or the lecture that's happening, leave, come back to the next panel, leave, go off to lunch, and come back. So it's expected everyone to be attending the panels. Now, when you have a bunch of young kids who are fans of this new hipster show called Star Trek, and they all of a sudden are filling the single panel slot with Star Trek after Star Trek after Star Trek panel, you have all these old guard science fiction fans saying, well, I don't like this new Star Trek stuff. I don't want to go to this panel anymore. So you have a lot of fans leaving this panel. Now it's dominated by young kids who want to talk about Star Trek. So finally, after Star Trek and Trekkies started dominating all these science fiction cons, someone got the brilliant idea of, hey, what if we held more than one panel at the same time? And we got the birth of the multi-track panel room. So basically, instead of holding one panel, now we can break up the panels into different panel rooms. So there's continuous panels happening. And back then, they used to organize these panel rooms by theme. So there'll be a writing track specifically for writing panels. You might have a fantasy track specifically for fantasy panels. And we kind of still have that today. If you go to some furry cons, there's specifically a writing room panel. Some pony cons also do that. Some cons also have a specific kid panel room. So it took about 4 decades, but they got the brilliant idea we could actually hold more than one panel at the same time. And this is where the Trekkies also got the idea of, hey, why don't we just hold a specific Star Trek convention? And that got really, really big. In fact, what is considered the first Star Trek con, well, there's contentions because there's a Star Trek con in New York, again, also a one-day event. But the first multi-day Star Trek con was Star Trek Lives, which occurred in 1972. And it had 3,000 attendees. That's larger than this con. It's impressive. Like, even the first Brony cons didn't hit those numbers until the second or third year. And that was, again, 3,000 attendees for the first Star Trek con. The second year, it had 6,000 attendees. It doubled. And by the third year, it had 15,000 attendees. It was so big they had to turn away the exact number that they had the previous year. So this shows you how big the Star Trek community was and how big the Star Trek con scene was. And this is where we get, even though the Star Trek fandom did not start it, it popularized a lot of concepts we identify with fan culture. So slash fiction, shipping, slash pairs, popularized more zine culture, more fan art, more fan fiction. Again, these things started not just with this fandom, you could say it started back in the Victorian era or even older when Greek myths were being retold and crossed over and over and over again. But specifically, we got the stereotype of what a convention attendee is with the Star Trek fans. And when you see how, people mock nerd culture for the longest period, they were kind of mocking the stereotypical portrayal of Trekkies. And I'll explain how Trekkies were treated, then later furries were treated, were very, very similar to how bronies were first treated. But again, a lot of stuff came out from these Star Trek conventions, multi-track programming, different types of panel rooms, and of course the term gopher for con staffer occurred during this time period. But after these Star Trek cons started exploded on the scene, they started to die down as well, just like how the bronies exploded on the scene started to die down. But these Star Trek cons were really well-oiled machines. So they decided to take their pre-existing con and decide to say, okay, we are now general conventions. We are the general multimedia, multi-genre pop culture conventions. And this is where you start seeing the shift, where remember science fiction used to be the general convention of this time period. Now the science fiction cons started to say, okay, we're going to be hard science fiction. So specifically focused on space opera, whatnot. And these former Star Trek cons who started rebranding themselves as general conventions kind of took the leg of becoming the new mainstream conventions during this period. So how did you find fellow fans in these large mainstream conventions? Well, this is where room parties really, really played a big role at these old science fiction cons and general conventions. So if you went back to the day, if you're a fan of Doctor Who, for example, how would you meet up with other Doctor Who fans? Well, nowadays, if you go to anime or comic cons, there are meetups where you can meet at specific locations and meet up with fellow fans. Nowadays, but back then, you couldn't really do that. So what they would do is most conventions are held within a hotel. So in the lobby of the hotel, they would have a bulletin board where you could write, Doctor Who fans, go to room Hyatt 302 at 8 p.m. and we'll watch old Tom Baker episodes, something like that. So you'll basically have a bulletin board where you could post your room party signs or write down your room and what fandom you're a part of, and people will go to your room and just kind of meet out and hang out. BabsCon, which specifically has a tradition that, because of the influence of how many science fiction fans and science fiction con runners helped start BabsCon, for the longest time was the only PonyCon to have a party floor and that bulletin board in the lobby where you could write your room parties and post them there. Everfree just started to do the tradition a few years ago, and you can see Everfree now also has its bulletin board advertising these different room parties. But this was the only way to meet with your fellow fans back then. And specifically, one type of room party started to get very, very big. So there was a group called the Cartoon Fantasy Organization. It was an organization specifically meant to collect Japanese media, specifically anime, which then didn't see wide release in America. Because back then, anime, or it was called Japanimation, never really got a widespread dub in the US. Sometimes they will dub some episodes and release it in Hawaii or the West Coast, but you never saw mainstream anime releases until the 90s. So a lot of these anime fans would basically collect recordings of these rare released animes and show them at these room parties. And you'll notice that even though this is specifically an anime-specific group, their mascot is an anthropomorphic animal, which is pretty interesting. Their mascot was actually an original species called a skiltear, which is a alien-like weasel. So this mascot for this anime convention became kind of so popular. Not only did it become their mascot, it was the name of the house that kind of is now known as the Furry House in California that archives and started a lot of these conventions. But as the anime room parties got so big, they branched off and became their own anime cons. The remaining group basically decided to stay and say, hey, we like these anthropomorphic animals and we don't have a term for this. Eventually the term furry would be coined, and these anime room parties became furry room parties. And the Prancing Skiltear became the name of the party that was held at WesterCon in 1985. Which is considered the first furry party, despite the term furry not existing during its time period. And then we got the birth of the Furry Cons. So the organizers for this party decided to create the first Furry Con conference. And it saw 65 attendees, so not as big as the Trekkies, but a fair size. And during this time period, the concept of a furry fandom started to consolidate because, remember, unlike these other fandoms, unlike Trekkies or Bronies, which are situated under a specific media franchise, unlike anime or comics, which are specific industries, and unlike fantasy and science fiction, which are specific genres, there is no specific umbrella that unites all furries. There is no specific genre, no specific industry, no specific fandoms. Sure, some furries might like Zootopia, but not all of them are in the fandom because of Zootopia or Robin Hood or Lion King. So furries are a very, very unique concept, and the identity was really, really solidified during this period in the 90s. Now, I talked about how furries start to be represented in the media was very, very similar to how Trekkies were represented in the media. So let me kind of explain. So when the Trekkies kind of came about on the scene, this was kind of the birth of the local news media. And when you had nothing really major to talk about, hey, there's a convention in town. So local news reporters would go down to this Star Trek convention. What's the first thing they see? People dressed up in funny outfits. So what are they going to print in the newspapers? Oh, look at this convention of all these man-children dressed up in all these funny outfits. And of course, that's how the Star Trek fandom was kind of satirized and parodied in mainstream media for the longest time. Like, there was no talk about fantastic Star Trek fan fiction or fan art or the philosophical debates you could go into about the concept of, the Federation and yada yada. It was like, oh, funny people in funny outfits. Well, in the 90s, the furry cons came about during the birth of the 24-hour news cycle. So when you have nothing to report about, what do? Oh, okay, there's a weird convention in town, let's go down there. And what's the first thing they're going to see? Oh, people dressed in funny outfits, so they called out the furries for, dressing weird and being secretive, and what are they doing there? And then the furries basically got the same treatment from the 24-hour news cycle as the Trekkies did when the local news cycle started to come about in the 70s. So fast forward another 2 decades. Bronies came about, right? And when BronyCons happened, this was around the time of online journalism. So when all these online newspapers needed to report on something, okay, a BronyCon's town, let's go down there. Oh, a bunch of man-children dressed in funny outfits, yada, yada, yada. So Bronies, furries, and Trekkies all kind of experienced the exact same attack and ridicule that each of these previous fandoms did before. And it's kind of unfair, but also kind of was the turning point for each of the specific fandoms. the Trekkies kind of embraced the geekiness and again became the progenitors of the multimedia conventions, which is why most multimedia conventions, like I showed in the clips at the beginning of the panel, were represented as these dirty nerds who dressed in Starfleet uniforms and talked, about crazy fan lore and whatnot. Furries, on the other hand, instead of kind of opening up, they kind of enclosed themselves, afraid of being ridiculed. They started to block media. They started to blacklist people from going to conventions. Because of that, the furries then had a secretive reputation. Why are they excluding us from these conventions? What are they doing at these cons? And it took a while for the furries to finally open up and become a part of the general population again. But because of how they isolated themselves, the furries unfairly got mocked for a period as well. Bronies, I think we kind of took the middle ground perspective because we didn't specifically enclose ourselves, but we became a little more selective with how the fandoms would portray, how the community was portrayed, because again, it's a very, very tricky situation with a licensed IP. You technically do not have the rights to having a convention around that. So, for example, if we think about other fandoms, you could argue the SpongeBob fandom, the Twilight fandom, the Harry Potter fandom are arguably bigger than the Brony fan scene, but why is it BronyCons dominate the scene? Why was it when Bronies first started, there was like 50 PonyCons happening a year, and that was more than all the Star Trek, Harry Potter, Star Wars cons happening at the same time? It was because of how the fandom's relationship with Hasbro was kind of at least at a standstill, or at least at a peaceful mediation. Because if we think about it, there are Harry Potter cons, but a lot of them disappeared after Warner Brothers and J.K. Rowling put the banhammer down. That's why you don't see Harry Potter cons around anymore. So this brings us back to what Purple Tinker did. So we looked at the Trekkies, we looked at the furries. What did Purple Tinker take from them? Well, she was a fan of both franchises. She's a furry, she's also a Trekkie, and she decided to take the furry model, which specifically comes from that old school Worldcon science fiction model, so the hotel room rates, the room parties, the specific way the artist alleys and dealers and panels were done, and paired it with how the Star Trek fandom was bringing on guests of honors to their conventions. So when we think about the Star Trek fandom, it's a very, very big franchise. You have the original series, the J.J. Abrams movies, to the new Star Trek Lower Deck shows, and whatever is happening on Paramount Plus. So the Star Trek fandom has a big franchise to pull from. You want to pull a guest from any single one of these shows, you have a big range of people to pull from. That is very different from what we Bronies experience, because unlike the Star Trek fandom, which has this big franchise to pull from, Bronies, we only care about one generation of My Little Pony. We're technically not a My Little Pony fandom. We are a G4 My Little Pony fandom. Most Bronies don't really care about guests from the first 3 generations of the show. And now that Gen 5 is happening, it's, again, very, very tedious of where the future will take us. But for the longest period, Bronies were only concentrated on a show that was still running. Because remember, the Star Trek cons started after the original series was over. But the Brony cons started within the second season still airing. So this becomes very tricky because now you limit the pool of guests you can pull for your cons. Because think about it, we only have like 6 main characters in the show, right? Voiced by 4 VAs. 2 of them are notoriously hard to get, so the other 2 are, you have 50 PonyCons around the country fighting for these 2 VAs, and it becomes a very, very tricky situation. And we'll explain why with this convention, Las Vegas's Unicon. So I'm sure with the groans we all know about it. This is our DashCon, this is our Fire Festival, this is our CanaCon. This was the original, and I would say that Las Vegas's Unicon actually had a bigger impact on the convention scene than DashCon had. We all kind of know the story, but briefly summarize. These non-Bronies decided to organize a convention in Las Vegas. They brought on a big list of talent, all the VAs, Lauren Faust, John Delancey, all the Brony fandom musicians and artists. Ended up, vendors couldn't handle real money, so they were given these fake money that they had to exchange at the end of the con for real cash. The VAs all of a sudden had like their autograph money being stolen, and all of a sudden sponsors who paid a lot of money to have these hotel rooms for being kicked out of the hotel room because the con is going to pay for them. And this basically almost ended not just the PonyCon scene, but probably ended the fandom. It was going to collapse. And you have to remember, around this time, this is where all these different groups, Equestria Daily, Everfree Network, Derby Hooves News, Ponyville Live, all these groups were fighting for control of the fandom, where we're not exactly on friendly terms, but they all kind of united and said, okay, like, we have to raise money to save this con, with to help make sure everyone gets out of there okay, because if we don't, this basically ends everything. And lucky enough, through the generosity of the fandom, they raised enough money, we're able to pay at least the guests of honor room costs, and some people to get back home, and some dealers and vendors some of their money back. And afterwards, there was a big sit-down meeting saying, okay, we can't allow this to happen again. And it's going to make sense it might happen again if you have 50 conventions fighting for all these VAs, overworking them, overstressing them. And Purple Tinker explains that really well. When you look at any other convention, if you look at anime cons and comic cons, they have lists and lists and lists and lists of guests of honor. Well, it makes sense, because if you annoy or piss off one of the guests of honor, you know, you have a big list of people to pull from. Like, who cares if we overwork one anime voice actor? We have a bunch of anime voice actors to pull from. Well, we can't really do that with the Brony family, because like I said, main 6 characters, 4 VAs, still working on a show. What happens when they go back to the recording studio the next weekend and say, hey, yeah, don't go do these Brony cons, they overworked me, I'm really stressed, I'm really tired. So because of that, a new type of department was formed called the VIBR Relations Department, sometimes called Viper, sometimes called Guest Relationship. And while some cons had the concept of a guest relationship department before, the Bronies introduced a very unique version of this. So basically, as opposed to seeing the guests of honor as just resources that you shove through autograph lines and all these panels, these were people that, okay, we have to kind of treat them with care, treat them with respect, make this a vacation for them, make it fun for them, and cater to their needs. If they're overworked, we stop doing the panel. If they're overstressed, maybe we don't do the autograph session right now. And after Unicon happened, not just the Brony convention scene, all the different cons around the country, anime cons, comic cons, basically had emergency meetings to say, okay, let's prevent this from happening again, and basically create their own version of a VIPR to protect against a potential Unicon. And during this period, you saw the birth of what Bronies brought to the scene. Bronies brought a lot. Even though a lot of these things were started outside of the Brony convention scene, en masse, the Bronies were really the first to adopt a lot of common features we see now. So pronoun ribbons, gender-neutral bathrooms, the communication tags. And that makes sense, because when you look at the founders and the con chairs for a lot of these Brony cons, they were predominantly trans women. And even very progressive fandoms around this time, the anime and furry fandoms, again, were mostly run by, by white males. So when you have a fandom that's really run by trans women, it makes sense that things like gender-neutral bathrooms, that's common sense. We need to add this. We need to cater to our guests. Pronoun ribbons, of course, that's common sense. That's a natural progression. We need pronoun ribbons. And so the Bronies were really the first to bring a lot of these things to the convention scene en masse that have since been adopted by other cons. Like, I remember when MFF introduced their communication tags, and all the furries were like, oh wow, this is ingenious, I hope all more cons do this. Well, BronyCon already did it 5 years beforehand, so this was one of the few times the furries were kind of late to the party. So speaking of furry cons, we had a group called Cutie Corral that made these little plushies. They decided to sell these plushies at cons. It's like, hey, we don't have enough cons to sell these plushies at, so they decided to create their own group called Corgi Events, which actually made this con, even though it's no longer connected to that former group. When you see PonyCon, they decided, hey, let's make fursuits, and started to become Lemongrad. And they ended up deciding to start making their own furry cons. So this is where Denver, Sin City, Murcon, Painted Desert Fur Con, and Aquatafur came from. They even bought Anime Milwaukee for a period. Then we probably all heard the story of how Corgi Events kind of imploded. And luckily, Ciderfest was saved by Charlie and Michelle. And it's great that they are so separated from the former Corgi Events stuff, because of the groups, the pony side of Corgi Events was run without really any connection to the furry side, and they're run really well. But because Corgi Events was started as a pony convention group, again, the concept of the gender-neutral bathrooms and pronoun tags made their way through them back to the furry fandom, and now the furry fandom's adopting a lot of stuff. Also, the furries started to poach a lot of things bronies, a lot of brony staffers, so a lot of brony AV teams, brony musicians, the furries started to pick them off one by one because, like, hey, the bronies are really good at running AV. It doesn't matter if a con has less than 1,000 attendees or over 10,000 attendees. If you go to any brony con, the concerts are like some of the best concerts you'll ever see. And it looks like we're kind of running out of time, so I'm going to quickly go through these periods. But basically, yeah, a lot of former bronies have kind of made their way and kind of become big outside the brony community, made their own way. And of course, as the show was ending and the final BronyCon was happening, there was a concept of the brony fandom dying. And of course, like, bronies heading to furry fandom. So we thought, okay, this is the end of everything, right? Well, not exactly, because the pandemic happened. And instantly, we had a new birth of pony fandom. And likewise, bronies are the youngest of the conventions. It was naturally that they were the first to kind of make online cons during the pandemic. Ponyfest Online is, of course, kind of the template that most of these online cons happen. A lot of these cons happen in Ponytown. And then later on, the furries were like, hey, you know, we could one-up that. So the furries started to make their own virtual conventions in VR chat, which kind of makes sense. And it was really the bronies that kind of got the ball running with these online cons, but the furries picked them up and really improved on them as well. But again, it shows that the bronies still had an impact on the convention scene, even after the show was over, even after BronyCon was over. And it really shows how, even though the brony fandom was kind of like a flicker, it ignited really, really fast and kind of burned out, with Everfree currently being the largest convention, it had a big impact in this entire family tree of conventions. And I think I want to end this panel on this video I took at the final BronyCon. I think it not only sums up this fandom, but sums up just the concept of con conventions, being unique in the con convention in general. Con happened in 2019. That was exactly 80 years after the very first convention Worldcon was held. It was the year of the 70 of one of the anniversaries of San Diego Comic-Con. And I think if I ever turn this into a documentary, that is the perfect ending point to not just summarize, the Brony fandom, but conventions in general, because even though Bronies were just a small part of it, it kind of summarizes what these conventions mean, whether you're a Trekkie or a furry or otaku or, a fan of Superman, Batman, Dragon Ball Z. We're all kind of part of this larger fandom. We all want a unique place for unique expression. We all want an outlet to kind of be with a family. And this is what these conventions are. And with that, thank you guys for continuing this 80-long-year tradition of conventions. Even though we had a pandemic, we are still here. We are at this fantastic convention that survived a lot over the last few years. It survived the entire Corgi event drama. It survived the pandemic. It survived many shutdowns, hotel moving. And with that, enjoy the rest of your time here at Ciderfest. Go to the panels. Go to the dance tonight. Thank you guys very much. Enjoy the rest of your time here at the con. Thank you. And if you guys have any questions, as I'm packing up, feel free to raise your hand and I could answer any questions or any comments you have. Yes, you
how do you separate, or how did you determine the separation between professional conventions and fan conventions? Because there's obviously
So so normally when I do this panel, it's an hour and a half. So since I'm going to focus on Bronies, I couldn't talk about that. But we could consider the very first professional convention.
My question is, would you like?
Oh, thank you. Yes, thank you. The very first one was Creative Con. So when Star Trek cons came on scene, people tried to market it. Creative Con was kind of the first to do that, and then we had a period when Comic Con boomed in the 90s. We had Wizard magazine switched to running conventions, and that's where you had the Wizard World Con. You had Informa, Left Field Media, Read Pop trying to make this entire con scene, and it really changed the dynamic of the cons, where it became a for-profit business as opposed to a non-profit thing. And so there is a separation, but the problem is so many cons have switched between being fan-run cons and pro-run cons, but it's still part of the family tree. But you can see there's very, very big differences. Like a lot of traditions don't continue that. So if you listen to Comic-Cons, there's no concerts. Never go to a Comic-Con and there's a concert or a dance, because it's something that's...
I was going to say, I love this panel.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah, this is really cool.
I love seeing it. This is like the third time